suffocating August heat clung to the town of Redemption like a shroud, baking the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything with a film of pale grit. For Annalise Chin, the heat was a physical manifestation of her own private hell, a constant, oppressive weight that mirrored the relentless pressure in her chest. She stood before the grimy window of Barlow's Pawn and Sundries, her reflection a ghostly, wavering image of a woman she no longer recognized. The gray silk of her cheongsam, once a symbol of quiet elegance, was now faded and worn at the collar, its subdued color a perfect match for the ashes of her life. In her hand, concealed within a small linen wrap, was the last vestige of her former self, a delicate gold chain and a pair of jade earrings, cool and smooth against her clammy skin. They were the final remnants, the last pieces of a life that had been dismantled with the slow, methodical cruelty of a rising tide. Each sold item, a silver-backed mirror, a pearl-inlaid comb, her husband's fine waistcoat, had been a small death, and this, she knew, was the final one. Taking a breath that felt as if it were drawn from a furnace, she pushed open the door. A tarnished brass bell overhead issued a discordant, mournful jangle, announcing her surrender to the stale, tobacco-scented air within. The room was a tomb of forgotten dreams, cluttered with the forsaken treasures of other desperate souls. Mr. Barlow looked up from behind his scarred wooden counter, his small, shrewd eyes taking in her slender form, the proud, straight line of her back, and the almost imperceptible tremor in her hand. A faint, predatory smile touched his lips, a flicker of satisfaction that turned her stomach to ice. He knew precisely who she was, and he knew precisely what this visit meant. He had been waiting for it. Across the sun-blasted street, Alistair Finch adjusted the cinch on his saddle for the third time, his movements slow and deliberate, a feigned task to mask the rigid tension coiling in his gut. From beneath the brim of his hat, his gaze was fixed on the pawnshop window, a sliver of dark glass that had just swallowed the only woman he had ever allowed himself to truly see. He had watched her for 2 years, ever since she arrived as the bride of a charming, fast-talking merchant whose promises were as hollow as a dried gourd. Alistair, a man who understood the unforgiving calculus of land and livestock, had recognized the rot in the man from the start. He had seen the reckless wagers, the ill-advised ventures, the slow bleeding of a fortune built on foundations of sand. And through it all, he had seen her, Annalise, moving with a quiet grace that seemed utterly out of place in this harsh, unyielding landscape. He had watched her dignity become a shield, a beautiful, fragile thing she held up against the encroaching ruin. For months since her husband's ignominious death in a card game gone wrong, Alistair had found ways to help from the shadows. An anonymous order for far more mending from her seamstress work than one household could ever need, paid for in advance. A tip to the grocer to extend her credit, backed by his own silent guarantee. But he knew this day would come, the day her pride would force her to the one place his indirect aid could not reach. Seeing her slight figure disappear into that den of vultures was like a physical blow, a sharp, twisting pain in his chest that stole the air from his lungs. He had respected her pride, but now that very pride was leading her to slaughter. The time for shadows was over. Annalise unwrapped the linen cloth with painstaking slowness, her fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. The gold chain slithered onto the counter, pooling in a small shimmering circle of light amidst the dust and grime. The jade earrings lay beside it, their deep, cool green a stark contrast to the bleached, splintered wood. They had been a wedding gift from her grandmother, a whisper of a life of honor and family in a land and ocean away. To sell them felt like a betrayal not just of her past, but of her very soul. Mr. Barlow picked up the chain, letting it drip through his thick fingers, his thumb rubbing over the clasp with an appraiser's insolent intimacy. He held one of the earrings up to the light, his expression one of carefully practiced disdain. "The gold is thin," he pronounced, his voice a gravelly murmur, "and the jade common, not the imperial quality." Every word was a calculated blow, designed to diminish her, to shrink her down until the pittance he would offer seemed like a gift. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on a crack in the far wall, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She would not beg. She would not bargain. She would simply endure. He let the silence stretch, a weapon in his arsenal of coercion. Finally, he named a price so insultingly low it was a gasp of stolen air. It would barely cover her rent for another month, let alone food. It was the price of a broken saddle, not the last artifacts of a life. "It's the best I can do," he added, leaning forward with a greasy conspiratorial air. "Times are hard." Annalise felt a wave of dizzying despair, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet. The fight was gone, leaving only a hollow, aching emptiness. She gave a single sharp nod, the gesture costing her everything. The door's bell jangled again, this time with a sharp, commanding authority that cut through the oppressive quiet. Both Annalise and the pawnbroker turned. Alistair Finch filled the doorway, his broad frame blocking the harsh afternoon light and casting the shop into sudden shadow. He was a man carved from the very rock and dust of this territory, his face weathered, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He moved with a quiet economy of motion that spoke of immense, contained power. He paid Annalise no mind, his gaze sweeping over the cluttered shelves before landing on a rusted, obsolete rifle hanging on the wall, its stock cracked and its barrel pitted. He walked to the counter, his spurs making no sound on the dusty floorboards, and stood not beside Annalise, but a short distance away, creating an undeniable barrier between her and the pawnbroker. His presence was so immense, so utterly solid, it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room, charging it with a tense, unspoken energy. "How much for the Winchester?" he asked, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Barlow, momentarily flustered by the unexpected arrival of the county's most powerful rancher, blinked. "The rifle? It's an old piece, a relic, more for show." Alistair's gaze did not waver. "I didn't ask for its history, I asked for its price." Confused, but eager to please such a wealthy customer, Barlow named a figure, a reasonable price for a wall ornament. Alistair reached into his coat, pulling out a thick leather wallet. He placed a sum of money on the counter that was staggeringly, absurdly large, 10 times what the rifle was worth, and, Annalise realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach, a fortune compared to the pittance offered for her heirlooms. "I'll take it," Alistair said, his gaze finally, briefly, meeting Barlow's. "And you will give the lady a fair price for her belongings, the price they are truly worth." The world seemed to stop. The buzzing of a fly trapped against the window pane sounded like a roar in the sudden ringing silence. Annalise stared at Alistair Finch, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. His words were not a request, they were a command, delivered with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The money he had placed on the counter was a clear, unspoken message to the pawnbroker. It was a bribe, a threat, and a rescue all at once. Mr. Barlow's face cycled through a series of emotions, confusion, then dawning comprehension, followed by a flicker of fear, and then oily avarice. He understood the game immediately. He scooped up Alistair's money, his hands moving with a newfound quickness. He then pushed a stack of bills toward Annalise, an amount far greater than his original offer, a sum that felt heavy and tainted. Of course," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. "A misunderstanding. For such fine pieces, for a lady like yourself." The words choked in his throat. Annalise felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, so intense it was painful. This was Charity, dressed in the thinnest of disguises. It was a public declaration of her failure, a performance of rescue that stripped her of the last shreds of her dignity. Her hand, which had started to reach for the money out of pure, desperate instinct, recoiled as if burned. She looked at Alistair, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of confusion and wounded pride. He was a virtual stranger, a silent figure she'd seen at the general store or riding at the edge of town. For him to interfere, to orchestrate this humiliating scene, was an intrusion she could not bear. Her pride, the only thing she had left, reared up like a cornered animal. She could not accept this. As he stood there, enduring the fire in her gaze, Alistair's mind retreated to the first time he had ever laid eyes on her. It had been a spring afternoon 2 years prior, the day the new merchant, Wei Chin, had arrived with his bride. The whole town had been curious. Wei was all flash and smiles, his suit too fine for the dusty streets, his words slick with promises of prosperity. But Alistair's attention had been captured by the woman at his side. She had stepped down from the stagecoach, poised and serene, her gaze taking in the raw, untamed coarseness of redemption, not with fear, but with a quiet, assessing stillness. He had seen the strength in her, a core of tempered steel beneath the silk and porcelain. He had also seen, with a clarity that was a curse, the recklessness in her husband's eyes. Over the months, Alistair had watched Wei's slow, predictable decline. He'd hear the whispers of gambling debts in the saloon, see the increasingly desperate quality of the man's business dealings. He saw the fine furniture being sold off, the carriage horses replaced by a single nag. And through it all, he saw Annalise hold her head high, taking in sewing work, her hands, once soft and unblemished, becoming pricked and calloused. He saw her walk into the market, her back ramrod straight, refusing to acknowledge the pitying or scornful glances of the townspeople. His secret love for her had grown from a seed of admiration into a vast, protective ache. It was a silent, helpless thing, a love that could only watch from a distance as the man she had married systematically destroyed their life, blind to the treasure he possessed in her. Alistair knew then that Wei's greatest crime was not the loss of his fortune, but his failure to see the infinite worth of the woman who stood by him. Annalise pushed the money back across the counter with a shaking hand. She turned and walked out of the shop, her movements stiff and jerky. The brutal sunlight hit her like a physical blow, and she staggered for a moment, blinded. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the suffocating pity in that room. She heard the door open behind her and the heavy tread of boots on the boardwalk. "Mrs. Chen." Alistair's voice was low, stopping her in her tracks. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his large frame seeming to soak up the very air around them. The useless, rusted rifle was cradled in the crook of his arm. "I do not want your money, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet laced with steel. "I do not want your pity." Her gaze was direct, challenging him, demanding an explanation for his audacious interference in her private shame. She needed to understand the reason behind this public spectacle, this strange theatrical gesture that had saved her from destitution at the cost of her honor. The entire street seemed to be watching, the silence broken only by the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the lazy buzz of flies. She held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away, her entire being a question he was now forced to answer. She was no longer a victim in a pawn shop. She was his accuser in the court of the public street, and her pride was the charge she laid at his feet. A muscle worked in Alistair's jaw. He was a man of action, not words, more comfortable with the silent language of the land than with the tangled complexities of human emotion. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the defiance to the deep, bone-weary exhaustion in her eyes. He saw the terror she was trying so desperately to conceal. His carefully constructed walls of stoicism threatened to crumble. He could not tell her the truth, that he had lain awake nights tormented by the thought of her suffering, that the sight of her quiet grace had been the only beautiful thing in his solitary life for 2 years. Such a confession would only wound her pride further, making her feel like a helpless object of his affection. He had to find another way, a truth that would satisfy her honor. "It is not pity, ma'am," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He took a half-step closer, his gaze unwavering. "It is respect." He let the word hang in the hot, still air between them. "Your husband, he was a man who made friends easily. But he did not understand this land. He did not understand its demands." He chose his words with extreme care, avoiding any overt condemnation. "I respected the way you stood by him. I have respected the way you have carried yourself since. There is no honor in a town that allows a woman of your character to be cheated by a man like Barlow. What I did in there was not for you alone. It was to correct a wrong." It was a partial truth, a shield for the deeper, more vulnerable one, but it was a truth nonetheless. He had acted out of a fierce, protective instinct that was rooted in a respect so profound it had long ago transformed into love. The explanation settled over her, unexpected and disarming. He spoke not of her weakness, but of her strength. He did not frame his action as a rescue, but as a restoration of honor, not just hers, but the town's. It was a masterful defense, one that acknowledged her pride and offered it a path to retreat. She searched his face, looking for any sign of falsehood, of the condescension she had come to expect, but found only a stark, unadorned sincerity. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. The world, which had been a blur of shame and fear, began to resolve into sharper focus. She saw the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, heard the creak of a distant wagon, felt the heat on her skin. She was still standing, still breathing. The abyss had not swallowed her whole. Alistair saw the subtle shift in her posture, the slight softening of her expression, and he knew he had to press his advantage, to offer a bridge from this moment to the next. "This is not a solution, Mrs. Chen. That money will not last forever." His tone was practical, direct. "My ranch, it is large. My foreman keeps the books, but his letters are as crooked as a dog's hind leg. I require someone with a head for numbers and an honest hand to manage my household accounts, to oversee supplies. It is a position of great responsibility. It requires character." He paused, his gaze intense. "The position pays a fair wage, and it includes a small cottage on the property. It is not charity. It is a business proposition. I need your help." Her breath caught in her throat. An offer of work, a wage, a home. He was not offering a handout. He was offering a lifeline, but one she would have to grasp with her own 2 hands. He was giving her a way to reclaim her independence, to earn her survival not through the selling of her past, but through the labor of her future. It was a gesture of such profound understanding, such intuitive grace, that it left her momentarily speechless. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had learned to sew and scrub and fight to keep destitution at bay. He saw them not as the hands of a fallen woman, but as the hands of a capable one. The weight of the past few months, The constant gnawing anxiety, the bitter loneliness, suddenly felt immense. A mountain she had been carrying all by herself. And here was a man offering not to carry it for her, but to give her the tools to set it down. A choice. He had given her back a choice. The one thing poverty had stolen from her. The last of her defiance melted away, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. It was not just relief. It was a flicker of something she had not felt in a very long time. A fragile, tentative warmth spreading through the frozen landscape of her heart. Hope. She raised her eyes to his, and for the first time she did not see a stranger or a benefactor, but simply a man. A quiet, steady man who had seen her at her absolute lowest and had shown her not pity, but a path forward. I accept, Mr. Finch, she said, her voice clear and steady. A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reply, but she saw the tension leave his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw soften in relief. He had made his choice in that dusty pawn shop, a choice to step out of the shadows. And now, in the unrelenting glare of the summer sun, she had made hers.